So good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Social Housing Roundtable. I was having a quick look through the YouTube videos, and based on ones that have actually been recorded, I think this is number 64 or 65 now. So not bad for just over a year of doing them. Really glad to have Veena back with us today. To anyone who is new to the Social Housing Roundtable, my name's Matthew Baird. I've been doing social housing recruitment now for over 11 years. I've specialised more recently in kind of management, head of and executive roles. So if anyone is looking for support in that space, please let me know, because all of that money that goes towards this helps fund these and keep them free for anyone and everyone who wants to attend. Quite often I get questions through of going, oh, can we come along? How many spaces can we have? On the online roundtable, just come along. Everybody's welcome. And if anyone's watching back and wants to join future sessions, please just say. There are all the old episodes on YouTube. You can watch them all back. We've discussed, well, I always think we've discussed anything and everything, and then a new topic comes up. And as I mentioned, I worked with Veena on a roundtable last year that went really, or beginning of this year? Or was it end of last year? Beginning of this year, that went really well. So when she reached out and said, hey, can we do another one later? I was like, well, absolutely. So without further ado, because I always find it's better for people to kind of introduce themselves rather than me try and do the introductions. I was introduced to Veena by Bromsgrove District Housing Trust when I was recruiting with them last year. And we've done some brilliant work kind of since. So I'll pass over to you, Veena, to kind of introduce today's topic and where the idea of that's come from. But just a big thank you for joining me today, really.
Thank you. And thank you for allowing me to come back and play again. So yeah, the last time I was let loose on this forum, we talked about why it feels as though a lot of employees are disengaged from their work. And, you know, we discussed a whole load of contributory factors, blame culture being one of them. So we thought it would be really useful to come and have a deeper dive of that. Is that me? With feedback?
No, I'm just muting. I'm just sorting out.
And the reason I'm kind of involved in this area is that I work with a wide variety of organisations, including the social housing sector, in my role as an employment law consultant and leadership trainer. And I thought I would start by sharing a story with you about a client interaction, just to illustrate what we're talking about today. So typically when I work with clients, when I work with organizations, you know, they will set out a situation, a problem, a challenge they've got, and I try and provide my clients with a number of options. I've never been the type of lawyer who just sets out what the law is. I try and work in partnership with my clients. So typically there will be a very low risk option, which often just means, accepting the status quo. There'll be a slightly higher risk option, and there may be a riskier option, and I will set those all out for the client. In this particular situation, the client needed a fast result because there was a real risk that a certain employee's behaviours were causing damage to their business. And so they went with the higher risk option. I helped them achieve that option. And lo and behold, the employee sued for unfair dismissal. They always knew that was a risk. And, the claim came in, and I then spent 6-7 months putting together a defence. And on the day before the trial started, the employment tribunal hearing, it was set for a 3-day hearing. The day before, the director who I was working with said, well, Veena, I hope the advice you've given us was the right advice, because, if we lose, we're going to be knocking on your indemnity insurer's doors. i.e., if we lose, I'm going to blame you. I'm not accepting accountability for the fact that I wanted the higher risk option. I'm going to blame you for it. And as it happens, it was fine. We won. The tribunal found in our favour, and we all lived happily ever after. Except we didn't, because my relationship with that client fundamentally changed. From then on in, I didn't give them 3 options. I only ever gave them the safe option. I just set out the law. I didn't give them anything else. And every time I gave them any advice, I always backed it up in writing so they could never come back and blame me for anything. And I soon found that my relationship with them just became transactional and soulless. And there was just no love there at all. And that's not how I work with my clients. And very soon after that, I terminated the client retainer. And I'm really fortunate. I'm really fortunate that I have the luxury of being able to pick and choose which organizations I work with, but most people don't. Most people don't. And there are way too many people who go into work day after day who work with those sort of people, knowing that if they put a foot wrong, they're going to have a finger pointed at them. And the worst thing about all of this is that, blame, that blame trait rarely exists in isolation. It's contagious. It's highly contagious. And, there is a reason why we end up with whole cultures that are based around blame. That's why we thought we really need to talk about this stuff. So let's see whether the technology is going to play today. Bear with me. Has that come up on your screens? Yeah, brilliant. So when we talk about blame, what are we actually talking about? At its most basic level, blame is about the tendency within a group or within a team or within a whole organization to assign fault for mistakes and failures to a particular individual or to a specific team, rather than looking at systemic issues, rather than looking at the set of circumstances that led to a failing. The blame culture is all about who can we point a finger at? And crucially, it involves a mindset that seeks to find someone to hold accountable rather than focusing on how do we sort this out, or how do we learn from it, or how do we grow from it. The sole objective of finger pointing is just to point the finger. There's no other positive outcome from it. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about blame. And if you apply for a job, and at an interview, Matt, you'll know this. The interview process in a lot of ways is a bit artificial. It's like speed dating, I guess. Everyone's on their best behavior. You couldn't possibly know that you're walking into a blame culture. But once you join an organization, I suspect within the first week, you'll know. And there are some key characteristics. So there's certain behaviors that you will see straight away. Obviously, there's the finger pointing. It wasn't me, it was them. It wasn't me, it was her. But also, there's the presence of a lot of punitive action. Rather than focusing on how do we put this right, or how do we give somebody support because they've struggled at this, it's all about punishment. Let's discipline, let's get them out of the organization. You'll see a fundamental lack of trust. People just don't trust each other. They're suspicious of their work colleagues, which then results in defensiveness, an awful lot of back covering, which is what I was doing with that client, by the way. And ultimately, we end up with toxic competition where everybody's in it for themselves. When there's a real focus on individual achievement as opposed to, a team, win. It's all about singular goals. Those sort of factors are really prevalent in a blame culture. And what you will see happening over and over again is this. There'll be some sort of mistake that's been made, some sort of failing, and there's an automatic who's to blame stance that's taken in these cultures. And when we get into the blame game, what it then naturally creates is fear. And when we get fear within a team, that will naturally lead to cover-ups. I'm nervous that I'm going to get blamed for this. I'm nervous that I'm going to be harshly treated. So I'm not going to tell people that I've made this mistake. I'm just going to keep quiet. And because I've kept quiet, guess what? We have more mistakes and more errors, and round and round and round we go. Whereas if you take out that first blame circle and then replace it, so rather than blame, we have accountability. You know, yeah, I messed up, this was my fault, or actually as a team, you know, we didn't quite take the right approach, and let's see what we can learn from it. You know, instead of fear, we have trust. And when we have trust, it means the next time something might go wrong or we see a risk, we're not going to cover it up. We're going to make it transparent. We're going to speak up. And because we've spoken up, we're in a much better position to stop further mistakes. But organizations get caught up in that blame cycle, and round and round and round we go. And there has been a raft of research on this. You know, in addition to my legal training, I have also been studying positive psychology and organizational psychology. And there is a ton of research on this, and particularly on the impact of blame culture on workplaces. The biggest impact is on psychological safety. And we talked about psychological safety in the last discussion we had. You know, that belief within a group that it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to admit mistakes, to suggest new ways of doing things without the fear of humiliation or unfair treatment. That's what we're talking about with psychological safety. And we know the research has shown us time and time again that in blame cultures, psychological safety is absolutely destroyed. People do not feel safe enough to speak up. And the biggest fallout from that, as we've just seen from that cycle, is that when people do see potential risks, when people do see, actually, I'm not going to hit that target, or, you know, there is a mistake that's about to be made, even when they're in a position to seek help and possibly avoid it happening, they're not going to. They're going to keep quiet. And then we end up with, you know, the mistake or the failing, and then get into the blame cycle again. So we know it has a huge impact on psychological safety. It has a huge impact on employee well-being and job satisfaction. You know, what studies show us is that blame culture results in higher levels of stress, reduced job satisfaction, contributes to increased burnout rates, and decreases overall well-being in the workplace. I don't think that anybody's surprised by that. That in turn has an impact on teamwork and collaboration, because ultimately, when there's constant blaming going on, it creates a culture of silence, right? And, you know, where, you know, employees become reluctant to voice their concerns, they're not going to feel safe in sharing their information or engage in those constructive conversations. And that then ultimately impacts on organizational performance. But the one that I think is really important is that last one on the list. It has an absolutely devastating impact on trust. That's the one that's a real killer for organizations. And there was a global study conducted by Paul Zak, who is a neuroeconomist. How cool a job title is that? I would love to be a neuroeconomist. But Paul Zak's study, fascinating. He found that trust levels make a huge difference to the employee experience. And as a result, the organization's productivity. I mean, look at this. What he found was that employees at high trust organizations are more engaged, more productive, and experience less stress and burnout than their counterparts in low trust companies. I mean, just look at the figures on this slide. So employees at high trust companies were 40% less likely to experience burnout, which then leads to costly turnover, right? They're 74% less stressed, they're 50% more productive, and 106% more energized at work. So employees in high trust organizations are more productive, they've got more energy at work, they collaborate better with their colleagues and stay with their employers longer than people at low trust organizations. Why are we not making this our absolute top priority? Look at the dividends we'd get from that. And yet we still allow these behaviors to continue because we're looking at short-term wins all the time. I think that's what's going on. So the question then is, why does this even happen? What is it that creates blame culture? And I think it's useful to look at why individuals behave like that, and then look at why organizations develop blame as a culture. I think it's quite useful to look at both of those angles. So, why is it that some people automatically jump from situation to blame? Why are some people so quick to blame? Because not everybody is. It's a trait in some people. And really, what it comes down to is that blaming others is a defense mechanism. When we blame other people, it's a self-preservation mechanism. What it does is protect us from feeling those painful feelings of guilt and shame and other vulnerable emotions. That's essentially what it comes down to. Very often, when we look at the research, it tells us that blaming is often part of the defense mechanism called projection, right? Which involves denying our own anxiety-provoking characteristics and seeing them in other people instead. But fundamentally, research tells us that blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. But that's essentially what it is. It has an inverse relationship to accountability, because by definition, accountability is a vulnerable process, isn't it? It would involve me talking to you about the fact that I'm anxious, I'm worried, and that I've made a mistake. It's the complete opposite. What's really sad, though, is that whilst using blame as an automatic response, whilst that might feel like a defense mechanism, in the long term, it does the opposite to people. It actually creates harm for the individual who has that trait. It creates harm for everybody else as well. We've seen from the research, the negative impact it has, but actually even for the person who has that as a natural trait, it creates harm for them in two ways. Number one, if you work with somebody who behaves like that habitually, or if you live with somebody who constantly puts the blame on other people, what do? We get fed up with it and we create a distance, don't we? We don't trust them as much, and so very often we will create an emotional distance. We won't share as much. We're not going to have a deep commitment to them. Loyalty is diluted, and essentially people who have this as a trait end up being quite isolated because we don't feel safe around those personalities. But secondly, if you adopt the mindset that everybody else is to blame, it's not me, there was nothing I could have done about it, what you're essentially saying is, I had no control over the situation. Others do. I have no control. Now, if I have adopt a mindset of accountability, if I'm able to admit to myself that actually, yeah, I didn't pay attention, I did overlook something, I am then in a position to learn what is it that I did wrong? What was my mistake? What do I need to do to ensure that I don't do it again? You know, I have the ability to grow and learn. Whereas somebody with a blame mindset is never able to do that. They get stuck in, I'm the victim, I have no control over it. Do you see the difference? So it doesn't do the blamer any good at all. And then, you know, once you have somebody like that in the organization, it spreads. It's so contagious. You know, when you work with somebody who, you know, behaves like that towards you, or merely the fact that you're witnessing this in your department, you know, that trait spreads very quickly. Leadership behavior is the touch paper in this. You know, once you've got people in leadership positions who behave like this, it spreads like wildfire. It just goes through the organization. And, you know, lack of accountability is a huge contributory factor.
It's the old chain of screaming, isn't it? Is
Yes.
that kind of thing. I'm sure we've heard of that one before. I certainly know. I know that's one of the reasons I left one of my old businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just filters down, you know. Then we end up with people, you know, fear of repercussions, that psychological safety being destroyed, you know, the excessive focus on individual wins rather than, you know, a team win. All of those things end up, you know, contributing towards a blame culture. But you know, the reason we're here today, what we wanted to really kind of look at is, you know, is there a fix to this? Is there something we can do to reverse this? If it's already happening in your organization, if you've spotted the signs already, is there something we can do to fix it? And I don't have all the answers, but the key is to lead by example, actually. If you are in a leadership position, you have to be the one modeling honesty and vulnerability and asking for help and admitting mistakes. You need to be the one that demonstrates that actually, if you make a mistake, we're going to reframe that failure. When there isn't going to be finger pointing, we're going to see what we can learn from it. Having said that, we do need to respond appropriately to poor performance. You know, if somebody just isn't doing their job, we can't just ignore it. You know, your service users deserve better. So we do need to address it. But when we look at employment law, when we look at what we are expected to do as employing organizations with somebody who is not performing, part of our role as managers is to, you know, make it clear to an employee, you're working at this level, we need you to be working at that level, and this is the gap that needs to be filled. That's absolutely what, you know, every manager should be doing. We shouldn't be staying silent. There does need to be honest feedback. There does need to be coaching. But what often happens is we go in, we address the performance, we issue warnings, formal warnings, and just leave that warning in isolation. And actually, any disciplinary warnings relating to performance should always be accompanied with training and support and feedback and coaching and training and development. We should never have warnings sitting by themselves. They should always be accompanied by the supportive stuff as well. And that's a true reflection on whether we have a blameful or a blame-free culture. You know, we all struggle at times. Sometimes we make cock-ups, sometimes, you know, we've made the wrong judgment call. It's about what we do about it. And, you know, in the modern organization, we have policies for everything, don't we? There are thousands of policies for absolutely everything now. But every policy you have in your organization, the ultimate objective it's not to sack people. The objective is to get an improvement. We're trying to get people to be better, and we can all be better. A blame culture will just be looking at how do we remove this person, get somebody else in, which is really, really short-sighted. But ultimately, it's about encouraging people to take accountability, to feel safe, to take accountability. So we have to ensure that psychological safety in place. We've got to model that ourselves. But in terms of encouraging people to take accountability, there are some key things that we can do as leaders. And number one, making sure that people are clear about their roles and expectations is really important. Often the reason why mistakes are made is because we think somebody else is responsible for this. So, we do need to make sure that everyone understands exactly what their roles are. Number two, I think it's really important for every person in your team to understand their why, understand why their contribution is important to the organizational goals. When I understand what it is that I'm doing to impact on my organizational goals, I'm more likely to take ownership of it. I think that's really important. Those discussions are really important. When you have your one-to-ones, that's got to be on your list every single time. Number three, I've found that giving people a sense of autonomy leads to greater accountability. And by that, I mean, rather than barking instructions, rather than telling people, right, I want this done by Friday lunchtime, you might feel that, well, I'm being very directive and clear in my instructions. But actually, if you turn that on its head, if your team member doesn't produce that piece of work by Friday afternoon, their automatic defense is going to be, yeah, but I knew I couldn't do it by Friday. That's the unrealistic time limit you set. It wasn't my time limit, it's yours. Whereas if that original instruction is couched as a question, can you get this completed by Friday lunchtime? And when the answer is yes, well, then they've accepted accountability. If the answer is no, I've got some, huge projects on the go at the moment, well, then let's have a discussion about priorities. Okay. If we prioritize this, this, and this, can you then meet the Friday lunchtime deadline? Yes, I can. There you go. Now you've accepted accountability. It literally takes, 2 minutes to have that conversation, but giving people that sense of agency, that sense of autonomy, can give you real dividends in terms of that accountability piece. But there are ultimately, when we have failings, when we have issues that are, splashed across the headlines, and damp and mold is still in the headlines, and I have no doubt will continue to be, because that's what the press have got hold of. It is tempting. I understand why it's tempting to look at who went wrong here, who made the mistake. We're hearing stories of tenants who've been, found in their accommodation, died months ago or years ago, or horrific headlines. And again, the press are full of who's to blame here. But how does that serve us? It's very rarely one person. It's very rarely one person. Usually we are looking at systemic issues. We need to learn to make that, concerted effort to stop focusing on who's to blame and instead look at what has contributed to this happening. It's a slightly different question. And, when we have to have those difficult conversations, because that's what this is about a lot of the time. I'm just going to take you off my share so I can talk to you properly. You know, when we have to have those difficult questions, and we have, you know, been notified of some sort of failing, some sort of issue, you know, rather than kind of looking immediately like as to who's to blame, I always ask myself 4 questions before I even begin a conversation like that. Number one, you know, what is it that's bothering me? What is it that I think has gone wrong? And then the second question I ask is, where's the evidence? Because sometimes the problem as it's been told to you is not the actual problem. Very often it's just a perception. So, you know, I put my lawyer head on and look for the evidence. You know, if the impression I've gained is somebody is, you know, really slapdash with their work, they're completely unreliable, and I'm really bothered by it, well, where's the evidence that that's happened? And number 3, rather than asking myself, well, who's to blame for this missed deadline, I ask myself a different question. And the question is, what factors have contributed to this happening? Not who's to blame, what factors? And did I have a part to play in it? Was there something that I should have done? Is there something that I could have done differently? And number 4, what do I actually want out of this conversation? And you know, the reason why most of us enter into these conversations, none of us like having difficult conversation, but most of us just want to get an improvement. We want this thing fixed, and we want it not to happen again. But actually, when you ask yourself that question honestly, what is it that I really want out of this conversation right now? Sometimes you want an emotional release. You know, you've just had the blame. Your boss has given you a verbal kicking. You want to pass it on to somebody else. If you're really honest about it, sometimes that's the mindset we're in. And if you have the conversation then, you will never have a constructive outcome. And it's always going to end in pain. And what we actually end up doing is causing pain to others, that you will end up, you know, pitting them against you. You're not going to get the buy-in from them, because, you know, ultimately I think most people will accept being corrected. Most people will forgive you for criticizing them. Most of us won't forgive those that humiliate us or embarrass us. Or
really interesting on some of that, because there's some points that have come up in the chat that I want to make sure we bring in.
Yes.
And thank you very much for a really interesting kind of perspective and presentation there, because there is a lot that goes into this, and I think there's a lot of other factors as well that play a part. Nunanga put in the chat there, your suggestions to rectify the blaming culture are very useful, but it is hardly, in her opinion, it's hardly found or perhaps difficult to witness in some organizations. I guess a bit of that comes back to the point you made before about certainly during an interview process, it can be very difficult, but other times, I think sometimes people can just accept that as that is just the way the culture is everywhere. And until you've seen what it's like elsewhere, sometimes that can be quite difficult. So I guess, are there other factors, I guess, that you would look at in terms of going, well, how can you really identify that this is a culture of blame rather than just, this is just working life? Because evidently there is a generational divide there as well.
Well, both points you've made are absolutely spot on. Number one, you very often, people whose first few jobs have been in that sort of culture, and I've met employees who think it's like this everywhere, but it's not. I work with organizations who are absolutely not like that. But I'd like to give you good news here, but I can't. The reality is, I think it's really difficult to know. I think from the outside in, I think it's really difficult to know. And, you know, I am certainly aware of a couple of organizations who have been named as, have received awards as being good employers. And I know it's absolutely toxic behind closed doors, because to get those awards, you know, and I'm not belittling those awards, but there is a way of presenting yourself and being seen to be a good employer in many ways, but for that culture to still exist. I think it's almost impossible. You know, there are platforms. Is it Indeed.com? There's Glassdoor. Those sort of platforms often, you know, people will leave reviews, but they're not very balanced, because who goes on there and leaves reviews? It's obviously going to be the people who've had the fallings out, and not necessarily the people who've had a good experience.
Or it's the people who are already working there and wouldn't put something bad about their boss because you're still in that business. So there is definitely a balance between the two, and it's a challenge. And I know businesses I've recommended that I thought have been brilliant, and then there's been a change, usually actually in senior leadership, and suddenly the entire culture's changed, and it's a constant moving thing. I think that's the other side of it. Matthias has put in the chat there, can you improve the employees who drive a bad culture? For example, gossiping, turning their colleagues against the company, that side of things. So I guess there's a different side on kind of that accountability piece, which is that if the business is trying to pull in a more positive way, or in a more maybe tenant focused way, and other businesses going, yeah, but we're more commercial than that. How do you bring those who are, I guess, more again, maybe not in line with the current culture, it kind of in line with the culture you've got? Is it best just to kind of train and then performance manage out? It is
Well, it is about performance management, but actually it's about behaviors as well. And, you know, particularly if you've got people who are being negative, you know, quite vocal and negative, and wasn't like this in my day and under the old management, and, you know, that can really damage morale. And employment law tells us that, you know, if somebody is displaying behaviors and a manager issues clear instructions, you know, if you are unhappy about something, I want you to come speak to me about it. Don't hold, you know, an open court out there. Don't moan to other people. Come and speak to me about it. If you've got an employee who refuses to comply with a reasonable management instruction, we are entitled to do something about it. We can take disciplinary action. I would rather not. I'd rather use a coaching approach initially, but you will get some personalities who cannot change who they are or refuse to change. And we might have to go down a formal, more directive route.
And on that, I know Anna Henderson had put in the chat, do you find that implementing things like performance related practices, I think that's PRP, exacerbates blame culture? And so that in itself, I think, ties in quite nicely with your point there, because I remember hearing
PRP, do we mean performance-related profit?
I will ask Anna to clarify.
Because performance-related pay, bonuses, effectively.
There we are. Right, okay.
Thank you.
Yes, and the answer is yes, because the focus is on individual performance. It creates inadvertently a bit of a dog-eat-dog culture, you know. It creates a culture of self-interest. And
it's difficult then when you work in something like sales, which needs a commission-based service in order for it to be, you know, you are paid based on that, and it's difficult. But then it's whether or not that's also fair for everybody, and that's when people say, oh, don't tell everybody about your salary.
Yes,
because everyone's being paid differently and things like that. So
yes,
all those play in. And
yeah, but although I am aware of organizations who you know, pay according to output performance, but also have a separate bonus pot for contribution. I think that's very cool. It can be a little bit subjective, so you have to be really clear about how you measure it, but splitting that performance in terms of outputs and contribution can address that.
I remember once hearing about a team-based commission structure that worked really, really well in practice, but then if one person wasn't pulling their weight but got payout, they got the blame.
Yeah.
Maybe they had stuff going on in their private life, which is why they didn't maybe perform that month. Charlotte, I've seen you'd raised your hand. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to, I guess, reflect on the point that, you know, we're talking quite often, somebody's put something on about policies and procedures and that being the response to trying to manage it and sort things out. And then just talking then about sort of performance related pay or, you know, performance discussions, and just wanted to, I guess my reflections are that the most important thing is relationships and building and connecting with people. It's a bit of what's been lost maybe through all sorts of different things like remote working, hybrid working, pandemic has kind of affected some of the connections and the relationships between people, between managers and their team members. And for me, all of it's easier to manage if you have a relationship with people.
Yes.
So that whole kind of point about people perhaps not behaving in the right way and or not performing, whatever that looks like, understandings of what things like performance related pay are about and why they may, you know, how the factors that will influence it are all much easier to manage if you're in a good quality relationship and you've taken time to connect, understand each other and build relationships, which makes the whole thing work much more effectively and does obviously have a knock-on effect in terms of concepts of blame. It's much more difficult to blame somebody or consider blaming somebody if you're in a relationship with them, as in a good, strong, working, connected relationship. And I think some of that's been lost just because of the nature of work these days as well.
Yeah, I 100% agree, Charlotte. Absolutely spot on. Because what relationship building naturally leads to is trust, which is the opposite of blame. But you're right. It has been. The quality of relationships has absolutely been watered down, and COVID has not helped at all. It really hasn't helped us at all. And, you know, I'm still not, I know, you know, COVID is supposed to be now gone, you know, and, you know, it's part of our history apparently, but the damage is still there, isn't it? The damage from silo working for all those months, and for some people still, I think still dealing with the consequence of that. 100% agree, Charlotte.
Thank you very, very much. I think if anybody does want to come in, please feel free. But I think what's important on that point as well is it ties actually really nicely into a couple of the points that are coming up. It's about culture. And Gemma Smith has said the top-down approach is really important, but not helped when government and other public bodies look for someone to blame publicly. It's easy to then it's filtered down into organisations due to fear. And I completely agree with you. I mentioned to Veena when we were talking about this last week, the best manager, or the best, not necessarily kind of overall manager, but one thing that is forever stuck in my head, they said to me, unless you do something completely outlandish, I've got your back and you're safe. Like, you do you, and I'll cover you, because that's my job as your manager. And that has always stayed with me as this piece of advice that just kind of went, well, actually, that was a culture then of feel free to make mistakes, feel free to do what you think is right. If you get it wrong, don't worry. Now, obviously, there's challenges in the social housing sector because of that, because what look like small changes or a small problem could actually be a massive problem, and you need to have that level of protection in place. But equally, you know, there needs to have been that accountability, I guess. I also knew my manager was accountable, kind of going, well, actually, I feel I've trained you fully. If you make a mistake and it's a horrendous mistake, that is on you. But if it's something small, I've got you. And it's that balance between the two that I think is really, really difficult in a sector that currently is always looking for the next big problem to come out, or the next big position. And I said, I mean, we said this on the last roundtable, we said this at the beginning of the year, this is going to be a really tough year for social housing. The news stories are going to keep coming out, and there's going to be more and more that people have kind of hidden under the carpet and are going to come through because the media's got their eye on it, and we're seeing that come through now.
Yeah, I have to say, yes, it absolutely needs to come from the top, but I don't think we should use that as the sole reason for not being able to make a change in our own team or in our own department or in our own little unit. You know, yes, it's always going to be the case that there's somebody in the leadership team who isn't displaying the behaviours that, you know, we talk about on round table. But that can't be the one thing that stops us from trying to create the right culture for, you know, our own team, because there isn't one culture in the organisation. there are lots and lots of different cultures within each team, and every single person in this room, we have the ability to impact on our team by leading by examples ourselves. We have the ability to make an impact in our families, in our friendship circles, in our communities, by the way we behave, and from the behaviors we tolerate. And I think we all have a responsibility to demonstrate what trust looks like and what a blame-free environment looks like.
Couldn't agree more. And there's a point in the chat there which follows on from Honey, which said board need to set the right culture and tone for the organisation, and then staff often follow what the board's behaviour. And I completely agree on one side of it. And for anyone who missed, it's like blow your own trumpet moment. I got voted in as co-chair of the board for Spring Housing last week, and I'm really chuffed. Still really chuffed about it. But there's always a question about culture. There's always a question about EDI. There's always a question about management. But the board is only there so many times a year and can only ask the questions, and only presented that information by an executive team that obviously you have to trust, and a management team you have to believe. And I completely agree with Veena's point there, because I know some businesses that if I'm recruiting at senior management, I have to have a very different discussion with them than if I'm recruiting at more housing officer level, because I know the managers can be absolutely brilliant and will have a different culture almost to the one directed maybe from the chief exec. And so it is, I agree with you, Veena, there can be a real different almost blame culture depending on who's in charge and who's in what position. There was a point I was going to make from Michelle, but she actually put her hand up. So Michelle, I'm going to bring you in. It's lovely to have you with us today.
Hi, thanks for that. Yeah, there's so much that resonates with this, coming from the social housing sector and then trying to be a coach and looking at that systemic stuff. So, a lot was coming up for me with regards to the emotional regulation, emotional intelligence, and it's that cognitive flexibility, isn't it? And it's how do we get people to shift? And when I look back at when I worked in the organisation, there was many policies, procedures, but these were felt that it was going to be used as an attack or to protect the organisation, not the employee. And I think is there too many to actually build that psychological safety, because it's seen as fear. If you haven't followed the policy or procedure, which has to get passed by board, there isn't much challenge around the policy and the procedure in the first place. If it's not working, change it. But that takes a lot of courage, especially if the director or the manager has written the policy or procedure in the first place. So yeah, with regards to the policy and procedures, do you think that there should be more challenge around them? Purely because it's that red tape in the social housing sector. There's too much red tape. And obviously you come from the law, employment law. I've seen it on both angles, and it's very complicated. So my hat off to you, Veena, about your career.
Such a good question. And honestly, I'm not sure we need policies for, every time we need a new pencil. And that's what it feels like. What we need the time and investment on, I think, is the people development. And you talked about, I wrote it down, emotional regulation. So, most lawyers, most housing officers, most accountants, most electricians, we go into work, and if you were told, right, today we're going to spend a day talking about emotional regulation, I think there'd be a few raised eyebrows, because have you seen my to-do list for the day? Have you seen all the important things I've got to do? And I think organizations are missing a trick, because when we fix that bit of the jigsaw, the emotional intelligence bit, particularly with leaders, it can save you having to get all the policies out later on to sort out the problem that's been created. I spent a few hours with a housing association yesterday talking about this very subject, and they're very forward thinking. So I got to spend several hours talking about this is what the emotional wheel looks like. When somebody is displaying anger, it's usually not anger. When you look down that wheel, there's usually something else. You know, anger is usually a substitute emotion for fear or vulnerability. And, you know, when we give people these skills, when we give people the tools and how to regulate that stuff, I think there is less of a need to rely on policy and process for all the stuff that follows. But it takes a particular leadership mindset to actually accept that, I think.
And that's definitely a part of it. Charlotte, I'm going to bring you in because I know you commented on this as well. So so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that I think one of my experiences of working within social housing, I'm working with a sector as well, but primarily social housing, is that the response to most things can typically be writing something down. So that whole kind of thing about the length of a strategy or the complexity of a requirement, the policies, procedures, all written down. And when we're working, trying to shift and change culture, the biggest words that come to my mind at the moment, and we're trying to instill, is around just trying to make it simpler. So simplifying rather than the level of complexity that's quite often there, that feels very like a burden around strategy, around policy, around procedures, and that's driven from board primarily. You know, that whole kind of process that is board papers starts that process to a certain extent, and having to get everything down and get it approved in that way trickles down the organisation. And my sense is that quite often that's a comfortable place for a lot of people to be, to sit and write and to craft and to draft strategies, policies and procedures that will govern the way, without perhaps focusing more energy on just the day-to-day, the language, the conversation, trying to keep it simple for people. But it's a massive shift in culture required. I mean, just immense. And I think some of it starts there. It's about where you put your energy and focus, and obviously behaviour, relationships, and trusting that you don't have to write it all down. I'm quite a simple person, so I'm a bit like, I'm sure it'll be fine. Maybe, you know, I think we can move slowly, but that's certainly what my experience is of trying to shift culture within social housing.
Yeah, you know what's ironic is that if we create policies that are very, very detailed, you're almost creating a rod for your own back, because, you know, if I write a disciplinary policy relating to stationery, okay, I know that's a ridiculous example, and I set out in my policy, you must not help yourself to our staple gun and our hole punch and our pens and the ruler, and I put a whole list on there, and then somebody then steals, you know, all the paper clips because I forgot to add it in there as a specific item. I've kind of created the problem for myself. Whereas if I write in the policy, I expect to be able to trust you and only use our equipment for work purposes, I don't have to create that list, and I'm trusting you. And we've almost got it the wrong way around now, haven't we? We think we can control everything by putting it down in writing. I think it might have been counterproductive.
But I also think there's an issue there with COVID in terms of people some managers still not trusting people to work from home effectively, unfortunately. And so everything needs to be monitored and everything needs to be regulated, and it gets too much. With a point there, a few points in the chat. Honey has said, when leaders accept their failure and apologise and take ownership and responsibility and go to a more learning mode, staff tend to open up, and they say when things go wrong and seek help rather than hide. Anthony Bradley had a couple of examples. When he worked at Nissan in New Zealand, they threw the conference room open, drinks were cheap. You could say anything to anyone, including the chief exec, who then challenge you to formalise what you said the next morning if you wanted to. Whereas conversely, with BA, we had a group of people who always said, well, we don't do it like that here. So I think that speaks a lot. Honey has said leaders and managers need to connect with people, ask questions, and create a place where they can raise concerns and worries. And Antine followed up by saying, after I'd installed one system, we had one person who still used Excel. So we took Excel off her computer and she was forced to use the new system. after a week, she apologized to us and said she was sorry. She didn't realize how good the new system was. And Anna, exactly, there is a wish to empower staff and increase their ability to actually resolve situations. But seeing, it's just gone because but seeing the procedures as a guideline, not an absolute, is an absolute key part of this. And Charlotte completely agrees with Holly there on the point around the board. And we've got a couple of minutes left. And the point I kind of wanted to make up about, which I think we've talked a lot about blame culture today, and I completely agree with that. I think on the accountability side, and this is a real challenge for housing at the moment, and just as a wrap-up point, and I'd like anyone to dive in on this as well. I go back a little bit to what happened in Rochdale, and obviously the young boy who died. And there was a call for the chair of the board to step down. There was a call for the chief exec to step down. And I remember a statement coming out, or a point coming out around that time, which said he wasn't going to step down because he wanted to be in charge of kind of fixing the problem, which was, I guess, understandable and completely understandable. But also there was then a lot of chat going on the comments on LinkedIn and things going, well, if he's stepping down, why isn't the head of asset management stepping down? Why isn't the head of the customer service team stepping down? Why isn't? Because everybody had a role to play within this. So the housing association as a whole was accountable, not just one person. And I think it's a real point we're going to see of a lot this year is maybe when problems come out, just as, obviously we had with Bolton last week, you know, what makes you accountable, or what level should you be the one stepping down? And also, is that actually going to fix the root cause of the problem? Because I know from being on a board, and I've had these conversations with Lara as well, who's president of the CIH, if I get something through which says, oh, we're 99% compliant, I'm like, well, that's great. What about the 1%? How bad are the issues in that 1%? Because it takes one item, like what happened with Rochdale, one house out of how many thousands they've got, and you will be deemed now for many years as a poor supplier until there's a big overhaul, regardless of all the good work that you might have done elsewhere. And I'm not in any way trying to like excuse what happened there, but obviously the balance then is forever shifted. And so I think there's an interesting point around accountability there. And I don't know your thoughts on it really, Veena, and where that might sit. I appreciate that's kind of come a little bit out of left field.
Well, the thing is, the odds are stacked against us, aren't they? Because as soon as the media get hold of anything like this, they want to see heads roll. The internet is full of trolls, isn't it? Wherever you go, everyone has their opinions. It's so easy to sit, look at things from the outside and, demand that everyone be sacked. I do think I think it's completely stacked against a problem-solving mindset. But when those big things happen, my view is, the first question needs to be, how did this happen? What are the systemic failures? Not who's to blame, but what happened in the system that resulted in this happening. We've got to start with that. We may get to a stage where it becomes inevitable that actually one particular person or one particular team absolutely didn't do what they were supposed to have done, and there was no justification for it. But that can't be the starting point. I think we're often led by the media headlines, and we're never going to get a healthy outcome from that.
I completely agree, and I think it's a really interesting point. And I can see Claire said, I don't need to jump onto the Housing Ombudsman session, but very closely related to what we're talking about today. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Veena, for joining us. Next week, bit of a different shift in tact. We're going towards creating a toolkit for the future of older people's services. So again, if you'd like to join, please reach out and let me know. But as for now, Veena, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you to everyone else who could be with us. And I look forward to seeing you all at a future roundtable. Cheers.